chapter 9, part 3. He had further established himself as one of the most notorious Don Juans. Where is he? Mayhem in the feminine world. Wherever he went, women completely lost their heads over him, and he treated them all with haughty indifference, boasting that no woman had ever meant anything in his life. One prominent lady of fashion killed herself over him, and because of him, 2 others were divorced. A sin considered in those days far more heinous than suicide. He was said to have gone in for all manner of vice, including an addiction to morphine, but was still youthful and strong enough to conceal the latter. The scandal columns were full of his amours and wild escapades, and a titillated society summed him up as being a combination of Casanova and the Marquis de Sade. Eventually, his behavior proved too outrageous even for the lenient French capital, and the local authorities requested the Greek legation to move him outside the country. The diplomatic Apollo, as he was sometimes called, was about to depart to take up a post in St. Petersburg when he was introduced to La Divine Sarah. The moment she set eyes on him, Sarah's divinity deserted her and she became all too mortal. Never in the course of her many love affairs had she made a fool of herself over any man, but over this despicable rotter she was for a time to become a complete and abject fool. When he walked suavely into her drawing room and kissed her hand with blasé casualness, she gasped. She was accustomed to men approaching her presence for the first time with courtly diffidence, even with a certain reverent awe. This arrogant devil appeared to regard the occasion as being of no more importance than going through the motions of meeting any feminine nonentity who, he took for granted, would immediately be swept off her feet by his irresistible looks and charm. Such obvious indifference was an immediate challenge. Damala sank into an easy chair, took out a gold cigarette case, and lit a match from a jeweled box. He probably knew that Madame Bernhardt never allowed anyone to smoke in her presence, but he also knew that he wasn't just anyone. They chatted for a time, he keeping his end of the conversation easy but carefully impersonal. At one point he let fall the remark that if he had ever had one ambition in life, it might have been to act. As a means of prolonging his visit, Sarah suggested that just for fun, he might be interested in reading over with her a scene from her forthcoming repertory. Damala, with a shrug which was indicative that nothing much ever interested him, said he wouldn't mind, and they read a bit from Frou-Frou, he taking the leading male role of Sartoris. He proved to have a certain facility. He also had a fine speaking voice with a pronounced Greek accent that gave it extra appeal in Sarah's opinion. By now, quite bedazzled, she told him he had great talent, and added that if he ever grew tired of diplomatic life, who knows, he might find himself in her theatrical company. He bowed courteously, kissed her hand as casually as he had before, and took his leave. Within a few days he called again, and then dropped by the afternoon before he left for St. Petersburg. Always his manner was the same, courteous yet distant, nonchalant yet slightly mocking. At one moment he was all graceful charm, at the next all cold arrogance. Sarah, who was rapidly losing her heart for the first time in her life, started losing her head. She turned on the full battery of the wiles which heretofore had made an adoring slave of any man she cared to conquer, but this time with no success. Damala was playing a game, and it amused him to realize that the most celebrated woman in Europe could be his at the wink of his long eyelashes. What's wrong, baby? No, it's okay. You don't have to cry. Don't cry. The nearest he came to any overt gesture was as he said goodbye. He kissed her hand, meaningfully held it for a palpitating moment, and whispered, "Come to St. Petersburg. I'll be waiting for you." Sarah was in a delirium of infatuation, bafflement, and frustration. She wanted this fascinating, this dissolute, this maddening seducer more than all her worthwhile lovers put together. Russia had not been on her itinerary, but she insisted that it be included. The St. Petersburg booking was impossible to arrange before January, and during the intervening months she was in a fever of impatience. She had, as usual, a current lover, and he, as not unusual, was her leading man. This time, not Angelo, who was also in the company, but a far more gifted actor named Philippe Garnier. Damala had spent the intervening time carousing with dissolute society and raising havoc among the feminine element of the Russian smart set. Then Sarah reached St. Petersburg, and the Bernhardt Damala affair started furiously and was the talk of the town. The two were seen everywhere together, and the actress would accept no invitation unless her lover were also included. This openly scandalous behavior was much resented by the aristocracy. When after one performance a certain Grand Duke sent his equerry with an invitation to supper, she answered that she'd be delighted to accept and would bring Monsieur de Mala along. A few minutes later, the equerry came back with a message that His Imperial Highness had remembered a previous engagement and to his regret would have to change his plans. Sarah didn't care. She was madly, idiotically in love. It could not have been a genuine love, but a sort of insane intoxication, a frantic obsession. There seems to have been little tenderness in this whirlwind affair. Certainly not on the part of Jacques de Mala, who was incapable of such a human emotion. One person who did care, however, was Philippe Garnier. Whether or not during his own romance with Sarah he had been deeply in love himself is debatable, but his pride was hurt. Moreover, Garnier was a man of distinction and taste, and it offended him to see this great artist make an utter fool of herself. Giving as an excuse a bad case of bronchitis and the severity of the Russian winter, he handed in his notice and quietly left for Paris. At that, Jacques de Mala handed in his resignation to the Greek legation to become an actor in the Bernhardt Company. The star whose infatuation had completely warped her usually unerring judgment cast him in Garnier's role of Sartori's in Frou-Frou. She also took Armand Duval away from the unfortunate Angelo and let de Mala go on regularly in La Dame aux Camélias. At least she had the sense not to let him play Hernani. He couldn't have anyway, for his mind, gradually deteriorating from the effects of brandy and morphine, was incapable of retaining the long speeches of rhymed couplets. As an actor, de Mala was rather atrocious. He had no qualifications beyond the overassurance of an amateur. His only asset was his good looks, for he had no technique, no sense of timing, and his strong Greek accent made him at times unintelligible. That irresistible charm that he exerted over women didn't come over the footlights, and he let down every scene he was in. Sarah, blind to his defects as an actor, kept insisting that he had genius, that given a few months' experience he'd prove to be one of the most brilliant newcomers in the theater. To de Mala's appalling defects of character, Sarah was also blind, or else she deliberately blindfolded herself. She must have known in her inmost heart that the man was a dissolute wastrel. She may have fooled herself into thinking she could reform him. She was not yet aware that he took morphine. He was still able to conceal the symptoms, and no one in the company knew he had the habit, with the exception of Jean Bernhardt. Jean would have been afraid to warn her sister for dread of what de Mala might do in retaliation. Also, Jean was able, through the Greek, to get her own daily dosage, for the young woman had by then become a hopeless addict. Sarah had a horror of narcotics in any form. Only the previous year in London she had come upon Jean giving herself a shot, and, seizing the horsewhip she kept for a pet puma, had beaten the wretched girl until she was senseless, then had locked her up in her hotel room for 48 hours to repent on bread and water, after which she assumed she'd effected a cure. Not many years after Jean died. A complete wreck. From Russia, the tour had continued southward. To Bernhardt's torments of physical obsession was added the humiliation of jealousy. De Mala, who could not stay faithful to any woman for more than a few weeks, was casting his handsome eye over some of the younger actresses. It lighted on a little person in the company to whom he started making advances, or, to be more accurate, the little person, as always, was making him advances which he was showed marked willingness to accept. Like an ordinary woman nearing 40, playing a failing game with a young lover, Sarah completely lost her head. Thinking it a means of holding her vacillating man, she proposed marriage, and Tamala accepted. What made him do so is not hard to fathom. The idea was so preposterous. It appealed to his sardonic character. He was getting a fair amount of acclaim basking in Bernhardt's glory, and once married to her, he'd be getting a fair amount of the vast financial sums she was taking in. They were in Italy when these nuptial plans were hatched. Sarah Bernhardt was a Roman Catholic, Jacques de Molay Greek Orthodox. It was impossible for them to obtain a license either in Italy or in France. Protestant England was not so particular. There was a 5-day break between the last performance in Naples and the next, a one-night stand in Nice. The couple, like two giddy runaways, skipped off to London, and on April 4th, 1882, in St. Andrew's Church, Wells Street, Sarah Bernhardt became Madame Jacques de Molay. She had finally anticipated being able to make it back to Nice in time. She had fully anticipated being able to make it back to Nice in time for the performance, but the ceremony had to be delayed over an hour due to the carelessness of the bridegroom, who had left the papers at the hotel and had to go back for them. The result was that they missed the boat train to Dover, and Bernhardt missed out on her professional obligation. The theater in Nice sued her for 25,000 francs for breach of contract, a sum which, in her state of married bliss, she cheerfully paid along with some outstanding debts of the bridegroom. She must have had an occasional inner qualm about this rash act, for she sent Sardou 2 telegrams. The first said she was about to die and regretted not having done his fedora. The second assured him that she hadn't died. She was merely married. In a few weeks she was giving out to her friends the feeble excuse that she'd gone into this because marriage was the only thing she hadn't experienced. On her return to Paris in May, the bride's first ordeal was to confront her son. "Maurice, chérie," she said, "I have news for you." "I know, maman," the boy said coldly. "You have married Monsieur Sarah Bernhardt." Soon after this, a benefit was being planned for some worthy cause, and Sarah volunteered to perform gratis the complete production of La Dame aux Camélias. Paris had never seen Sarah Bernhardt's Marguerite Gauthier. Also, they had never seen Monsieur Sarah Bernhardt as an actor. Later, many wished they never had, as far as the latter was concerned. The house had been agog to watch his performance. When he made his first entrance, there was much excitement. Whispers of, "It's he," and "Sarah's husband." Opera glasses were focused, and people strained to get a better view. Whatever they were expecting, they were definitely let down. He was not good. He was also not bad, which might at least have made for a few titters. The next day the press was wildly enthusiastic over Bernhardt's performance, but justly critical of her leading man. One critic called the whole thing an exhibition which did not turn out a happy one. He admitted that, in the last act, the handsome young man had a few movingly sincere moments, and wound up by saying, "With a great deal of work he might perhaps make a passable actor. Certainly he has with him a great teacher whose coaching should prove profitable." De Molay, who read his notices with increasing fury, found this last cut especially galling. Anything but chastened, he accused the critics of jealousy and of deliberately plotting against him. Also, for some distorted reason, he blamed his wife for his fiasco. She, after glancing at the notices, dismissed them with, "Bah, it means nothing. I had as bad or worse when I started out." A few weeks later, Sarah played a short return engagement in London, taking along de Molay as lead and limiting the repertory to La Dame. The opening night, the house again went wild over divine Sarah. Toward the far from divine de Molay they were polite, due doubtless to native sentimentality and the knowledge that the two were newlyweds. La Dame was the sensation of the theatrical season. The Prince and Princess of Wales attended a performance and afterward went back to the green room to congratulate her. The beautiful future Queen Alexandra put her arms about the actress and, still crying, said, "Oh, madame, I am so happy to find you alive after that last act." The Bernhardt cult was as ardent as ever. Fans fought for the scraps of the handkerchief which she tore up in the scene with the elder Duval, souvenirs which one of her maids was clever enough to save and sell to throngs outside the stage door. Sarcey, who seems to have trailed her travels like some international spy, again came across from Paris and wrote back, "Nothing can give an idea of the craze that Sarah Bernhardt is exciting. It's a mania." In the theater, when she's about to appear, a tremor runs through the audience. She appears and an awe of admiration and astonishment escapes from every throat. Wherever you go, it's her they're discussing. All this furor over his wife piqued Damala's colossal egotism. He began regretting this absurd marriage. He also began taking larger quantities of morphine. Madame Sarah's next project was Fedora, and it was a major one. Fedora is an out-and-out melodrama so cleverly contrived it gives the illusion of being distinguished theater. The plot is the love story of a nihilist and a fascinating Russian princess. At that time, Russia was all the vogue, and nihilists were as surefire a theme for plays and popular novels as westerns are on today's television. The Princess Fedora is led to believe that a nihilist named Loris Ipanov has murdered her husband. The Princess Fedora is led to believe that a nihilist named Loris Ipanov has murdered her husband and plans a revenge by causing the man to fall in love with her so that she can entice him into the hands of the secret police. Instead of her scheme working out that way, Fedora falls madly in love with Loris, who turns out to be neither a nihilist nor the murderer of her husband, who, incidentally, proves to have been an unfaithful scoundrel. And rather than have her lover discover her attempted treachery, the lady takes poison and ends up in one of those writhing death scenes that were the Bernhardt specialty. The whole thing is, of course, preposterous, but Sardou's brilliant craftsmanship made it seem believable. Fedora, wrote Maurice Baring, is no more like a Russian princess than Jules Verne's Michael Strogoff is like a novel of Tolstoy. However, it offers an actress a superb chance to pull out all the stops. The role of Loris Ipanov is also excellent, and the star was determined that her husband should play it. Sardou was equally determined that he should not. Before leaving for London, she had expressed this wish to Sardou, who had made evasive replies to the effect that Damala was indeed a very handsome fellow who doubtless would develop into quite an actor, but he carefully refrained from committing himself. Sarah, however, went ahead and committed herself with Damala mainly to put him in a better humor. When she returned to Paris, she immediately brought up the subject with Sardou, who very politely but firmly said no. She argued, she implored, she threatened to give up the whole project, but Sardou, still charmingly polite, was adamant. He was backed up by Raymond Deslandis, who stated bluntly that if Damala were cast as Ipanov, he would not produce the play. For once Sarah lost a battle, and Pierre Berton was cast for the role. Damala was outraged. He spent his hours at home, or rather his wife's home, in baleful sulking broken by outbursts of childish temper. Sarah's cajoling only served to make his mood more ugly. Finally, by way of a somewhat expensive consolation prize, she took over a theater for him. This was the Ambigu, and she signed the lease in her son's name, making Maurice the managing producer of the house and director of whatever plays would appear on the agenda. Maurice Bernhardt was all of 18, and he had the inexperience and swagger of a completely spoiled mother's darling. Oddly enough, as a director, he had acquired a certain sense of staging from that incomparable directress, who doubtless coached him in every move. In his dealings with actors and personnel, he was affable one moment, arrogant the next, and in business matters utterly incompetent. After acquiring the theater for her husband, Bernhardt set about finding a play and came up with Les Marais Ennemis by her good friend, the Parnassian poet Catulle Mendes. It opened in mid-November of '82, and oddly enough, Jacques Damala in the starring role was not at all bad. The press was lenient, even kind, and the man's resentments were momentarily assuaged. All the work and planning that went into this enterprise Sarah undertook at the same time that she was rehearsing for Dora. If Sarah's marital turmoil was sapping her spirit, these rehearsals were giving her a new charge of rejuvenating energy. Sardou himself did the directing of all his plays. Known as Le Roi des Metteurs en Scène, he was as brilliant a director as he was a playwright. Sardou was an attractive man with wit, warmth, and, when justly provoked, sudden rages which had a certain picturesque allure. Working with him was an exciting stimulant. To Bernhardt he stood for the theatre of an epoch, its smile, its joy, its terror, and its strength. He lifted every player's morale. For him, Bernhardt always made a special effort, was careful about her clothes, and turned on extra volts of her electrifying charm. He would arrive at rehearsals bundled in a fur-lined coat and swathed in a voluminous muffler, for he had a neurotic fear of draughts, even for a Frenchman, and a velvet beret like Wagner's which he kept pulling about. In those unhampered days of the stage hands' union had not enforced its frustrating regulations on the theatre, and a play was rehearsal in its finished set, complete with furnishings, while the actors were allowed to handle the actual props. Before starting the day's work, Sardou would test every chair, make certain every door worked, inspect every item on the prop list. After the actors started, he'd watch each move, listen to each word from all over the darkened house. The front row, the side boxes, the back of the top gallery. All the while flinging off his coat and muffler one minute, then putting them back on the next. Toward 3 p.m., he'd tire of such gymnastics and knock off work for a short respite, during which he'd have ordered cakes brought in from a nearby cake shop, which he'd share with the cast along with some of his excellent port, which had been a gift from the King of Portugal. Port from Portugal. All during the recess, he'd talk a blue streak, recounting endless amusements, stories, and anecdotes.